the Emanuel Hasikovic Professor for 19th and 20th Century Art at Tel Aviv University, where he also served as the Dean of the Arts for many years. So he's both a researcher and a university administrator. Freddie and I first talked about theater and philosophy many years ago when we took a walk along Mainz, near Mainz University, and he first talked to me about this idea he had about thinking about the relationship between theater and philosophy by looking at encounters between philosophers and theater people, either fictional encounters or actual encounters. And he also complained that there was no good word in English for theater people. Well, the happy end of this story is this wonderful book we all know, Philosophers and Thespians. That was his, exactly, the coinage. And it's exactly that. It revolves around actual encounters. And I think it's a wonderful idea. It's a dramatic idea of thinking about theater and philosophy. We've dealt with a lot of abstractions. I think that's right. But I think in this attempt to think about philosophy and theater as kind of abstract systems, it's good to think about actual encounters between philosophers and thespians. Now, one could say that this follows a kind of logic outlined by Aristotle, that drama is closer to philosophy than history because it deals with universals. But Freddie Rokem actually also deals with that other side of drama, namely its relation to history, in a very influential book called Performing History. So Freddie's work deals with both of these sides, the side of theater looking to history and the side looking to philosophy, and with many other things too. There's a wonderful book, for example, about Strindberg called Strindberg's Secret Codes. And if you wonder why Freddie is capable of reading Strindberg's secret codes, the answer is that, of course, because he can read Strindberg in the original, because I don't know how many people here know that he actually grew up in Sweden. So there are many, many sides to this wonderful mind and career, but you have come here to hear Freddie Rokem, not me, so without further ado, I give you my old comrade in arms in all things theater and philosophical, Freddie Rokem.
Thank you very much, Martin. I also want to thank Paolo and his team for organizing this conference. And I think the peak for me in getting to know Paolo was when he was singing last night. I think that really said something very, very fundamental about why we're here. So the topic of my talk today is a little different from the what's written there. It's the logic of in Sophoclean tragedy, Antigone and Oedipus Tyrannos. And I will begin by a quote from an early essay by Walter Benjamin called The Theory of Criticism. Suppose you make the acquaintance of a young person who is handsome and attractive, but who seems to be harboring a secret. It would be tactless and reprehensible to try to penetrate this secret and wrest it from him. But it is doubtless permissible to inquire whether he has any siblings, to see whether their nature could perhaps explain somewhat the enigmatic character of the stranger. This is exactly how the true critic inquires into the siblings of the work of art. And every great work has its sibling in the realm of philosophy. Just as philosophy makes use of symbolic concepts to draw ethics and language into the realm of theory, in the same way it is possible for theory, parenthesis, logic, to be incorporated into ethics and language in symbolic form. We then see the emergence of ethical and aesthetic critique. This was 1919, 1920. Aristotle's contributions to logic, developing a systematic treatment of the principles governing correct inference, have been fundamental for Western thought. According to the entry on Aristotle in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by philosopher Christopher Shields, he relied on the contributions of previous generations of writers and thinking, but, quote, no one before Aristotle have ever attempted to codify the formal and syntactic principles at play in such inference, end quote. In my contribution to the conference on drama and philosophy, I will pay special attention to the ways in which logic is at play in Sophocles' Antigone and Oedipus Tyrannos, presenting some preliminary ideas how logical thinking, in particular the deductive syllogism and the law of the excluded middle, having been embedded in and can therefore also be extracted from these plays. I will focus on the principles of logic activated by the narrative structures and the dramatic conflicts of these tragedies, as well as through the actions and words of their protagonists. In the entry on Aristotle in the same article, the author says, quote, in Aristotle's logic, the basic ingredients of reasoning are given in terms of inclusion and exclusion relations. He begins with the notion of a patently correct sort of argument, one whose evident and unassailable acceptability induces Aristotle to refer to it as a perfect deduction. Generally, a deduction, syllogismon, according to Aristotle, is a valid and acceptable argument. More exactly, a deduction is, quote from Aristotle, an argument in which when certain things are laid down, something else follows of necessity in virtue of their being so, end quote. And, adds Shields, quote, a deduction is the sort of argument whose structure guarantees its validity, irrespective of the truth or falsity of its premises, end quote. By combining at least three statements on the basis of exclusion and inclusion, like the partly overlapping circles of a Venn diagram, which has somewhere meeting, a deductive syllogism establishes a fictional narrative, scaffolding, or skeleton, which, like mimesis, which Aristotle theorized in the Poetics, is based on principles of selection, of inclusions and exclusions. Oedipus Tyrannos served as Aristotle's prime example for tragedy in the Poetics, which also makes a brief mention of Antigone. But as far as I know, Aristotle himself never made any explicit comparison between the basic syllogistic narrative and tragedy, and it is possible that this is also the case, though I don't know, in the vast literature on Aristotle as well as on Sophocles' tragedies. However, the seemingly self-evident, even somewhat trivial formulation in the 7th chapter of the Poetics that a tragedy must have three parts in order to be complete, a beginning, a middle, and an end, should not be understood naively, as if it was considering three acts in a play, but rather as an implied reference to the three parts of the deductive syllogism. In Aristotle's own formulation from the Poetics, and I quote, a beginning is that which does not itself follow anything by causal necessity, but after which something naturally is or comes to be. An end, on the contrary, is that which itself naturally follows some other thing, either by necessity or as a rule, but has nothing following it. A middle is that which follows something as some other thing follows it. A well-constructed plot, therefore, must neither begin nor end at haphazard, but conform to these principles. End quote, Aristotle. Defining the beginning of a tragedy as that which does not itself follow anything by casual necessity, but after which something naturally is or comes to be, corresponds to the initial universal statement of the deductive syllogism, serving as the point of departure, the beginning, for the thought experiment or fictional construction, which is continued by the second statement, which in turn serves as the bridge to the final conclusion, which, quote, has nothing following it, end quote. On the basic variant, one basic variant of the deductive syllogism begins with a universal proposition that all x are y, followed by another universal proposition, all z are x. The conclusion that all z are y thus follows of necessity from the first two statements. A well-known example of this form of syllogism, consisting of three universal propositions, is all humans are mortal, all Greeks are humans, therefore all Greeks are mortal. It is also possible, and this seems to be the dominant mode of syllogisms embedded within tragedy, though not the only one, that instead of being followed by another universal proposition, which in turn leads to a universal conclusion, the initial universal proposition is followed by a particular statement, which in turn leads to a particular conclusion. A well-known and frequently quoted instance of this form of syllogism, known as the Barber syllogism, is all humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. At the same time as the inner logic of this paradigmatic syllogism is undisputable, its contents draw attention to a foundational moment of Western philosophy, the death of Socrates. But Socrates' death from drinking the hemlock is also something that made him immortal. According to Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, the influence of Socrates has, and I quote, the influence of Socrates has extended down through posterity to this very moment, and indeed stretches into the future in its entirety like a shadow, which grows in the evening sun at the same influence again and again necessitates the recreation anew of art in the already metaphysical, broadest and deepest sense, and how its own infinity guarantees the infinity of art also. End quote. Birth of Tragedy. Plato immortalized this foundational moment in his dialogues, depicting how just before drinking the hemlock, Socrates comforted his companions by sharing his belief in the immortality of the soul and the eternal forms with them. Socrates' physical death confirms the deductive syllogism based on the universal statement that all humans are mortal, while his immortality is based on a counter-syllogism beginning with a contradictory universal statement that the soul and the eternal form are the foundation for human immortality. The incommensurability between these universal statements, based on the law of the excluded middle or the dialectics between them, have initiated an unbroken chain of discourses about Socrates' influence on philosophy. Nietzsche's text raises two basic questions. Should the figure of the growing shadow in the evening sun be understood as a reference to the flickering images on the wall in Plato's cave parable from the Republic that are nothing but faint reflections of true reality? Or should we instead grant the understanding of Socrates' immortality as a guarantee for what Nietzsche claimed is the recreation anew of art in the already metaphysical, broadest and deepest sense, thus promising the infinity of art? The Birth of Tragedy, as we've heard already today, presented a historical narrative or a scenario exploring the intricate border landscapes between philosophy and poetry and the dynamics between them. Tragedy was born through a union of abstract principles, but waned through the birth of philosophy in an eternal cycle that Nietzsche initially believed is repeating itself at the time when he was writing. In what follows, I will attempt to map a similar border landscape, following Benjamin's intuition that every great work has its sibling in the realm of philosophy. Sophocles' two most known tragedies and their relations to Aristotelian logic is paradigmatic for this interaction between the discursive practices of drama, theater, performance, and philosophy, charting a field which is gradually re-emerging as a major research area, perhaps even signaling a paradigm shift. My initial reflections about these interactions, as Martin pointed out, follow Aristotle's own directive in the chapter 9 of the Poetics, and now I quote, that the distinction between historian and poet consists really in this, that the one describes the thing that has been and the other a kind of thing that might be. Hence poetry is something more philosophic and of graver import than history, since its statements are of the nature rather of universals, whereas those of history are singulars. According to Aristotle, poetry is situated between history and philosophy, and because of its more universal nature is of graver import, a better thing, or something to be taken more seriously than the particular events of history. Poetry is situated between the discursive practices representing specific events in the past, generating our sense of history, and what might be in the future as an always and as yet unrealized utopian and universal potentiality of logic purity. The position assigned to poetry primarily drawn to the universals of philosophy, including logic on the one hand, while at the same time contextualizing these universals through particular events on the other, implies that the work of art is imbued with a radical ontological instability, constantly fluctuating between the universal and the particular. In this respect, poetry reproduces the inner dynamics of the Barbara syllogism, where on the basis of a universal claim, the particular actions are contextualized within a fictional universe. But whereas the syllogism reaches a clear conclusion, poetry, tragedy, or poetry presents a challenge to the law of the excluded middle, in particular with regard to what it means to be human, resisting the necessity of logical structures while at the same time affirming their basic validity. I think this is probably the center of what I'm saying. The challenge to the law of the excluded middle, in particular with regard what it means to be human, resisting the necessity of logical structures while at the same time affirming their basic validity. And as the short example from The Birth of Tragedy, as well as many of Plato's dialogues show, the ontological instability of poetry is also a condition which philosophical discourses frequently have to account for. My analysis will begin by identifying the intricate networks of interacting syllogisms and logical structures that have been embedded and contextualized within Sophocles' two most known plays, serving as the foundation for their complex, multidimensional dramatic conflicts. The next step will show how the particular syllogisms have been contextualized within the fictional world of these tragedies from a broad range of social, political, legal, ideological, religious, and philosophical perspectives. These contextualizations, integrating the network of syllogisms within the concrete circumstances of a fictional world as opposed to the bare narrative scaffolding of the syllogism, activate a hermeneutical process through which the reader, actor, spectator of a particular tragedy is invited to consider what it means to be human and to consider, or as Bertolt Brecht would have formulated this form of address to the readers and spectators, to form an opinion concerning the ethical consequences of the actions of the protagonists within these fictional contexts. This procedure establishes a constantly receding hermeneutical horizon for formulating universal propositions about human nature, which in principle, following Derrida's directive in his essay Signature Event Context, is a perpetual process. I shall, Derrida claimed, try to demonstrate why a context is never absolutely determinable, or rather why its determination can never be entirely certain or saturated, end quote. This is not only the case in philosophical discourses, with Derrida referring to Austin's speech act theory, but is probably true for other cultural practices as well. The openness of this process, resisting the finiteness of deductive logic, is obviously one of the reasons why certain tragedies still continue to fascinate us, preserving what Stephen Greenblatt has termed their social energies, constantly relying on the active participations of readers and spectators for new and even innovative interpretations in increasingly more complex contexts and situations, testing our ability to contain and even to accept the tensions between the logical necessities and the underlying syllogisms in relation to the randomness and instability of human life. And as I will show by referring briefly to Martin Heidegger's and Judith Butler's reading of Antigone, these tensions in turn constitute the complex cultural and public spheres where the questions of human natures and issues of moral judgment emerge. Antigone. Antigone has become a model case for establishing such hermeneutical horizon. The position of Antigone and Creon can be formulated as two incommensurable positions, whereas Hegel pointed out Antigone represents the family or kinship structures and Creon the larger collective of the polis. Following the two opening scenes of the play, where the conflict between the two positions is introduced, the chorus contextualizes this conflict in the Ode to Man, revealing the tensions between man as a political creature who at the same time belongs to a family based on kinship regulations, as well as the human ability to use language to negotiate the complex tensions between the political and familial, between the public and the private spheres, between law and justice. The play opens with Antigone's presentation of the syllogism on the basis of which she acts by burying her brother Polynicus. It is a syllogism with a clearly formulated subject position. To be human means to bury our dead or kin as the gods have commanded us to do. Polynicus is my dead brother, therefore I must and will bury Polynicus. The syllogism which guides the actions of Creon is somewhat more difficult to formulate, but the following formulation presents his subject position. The gods have given the sovereign the exclusive right to legislate. I am the sovereign, therefore there are no limits to my lawmaking privileges, even if these laws are against the interests of my own family. Creon's argument can also be formulated as a syllogism about Polynicus. It is against the law to bury enemies. Polynicus is an enemy of the polis. It is illegal to bury Polynicus. The conflict between Antigone and Creon is based on the incommensurability of these syllogistic positions. Relying on the divine authority evoked by both of them, it is either legal or illegal to bury Polynicus. It cannot be both. Such a situation was formulated by Aristotle as the law of the excluded middle, according to which P and not P is always false. Or according to Aristotle's own formulation in the Metaphysics, quote, it is impossible that the same thing can at the same time both belong and not belong to the same object and in the same respect, end quote. But does this law of thought always correspond to the literary practices of Sophoclean tragedy? As we shall see, at the same time as Sophocles no doubt was deeply aware of the law of the excluded middle, he radically challenged it. After the presentation of the incommensurable conflict between the syllogisms of Antigone and Creon, the chorus formulates what it means to be human. Here is, I will quote an abbreviated quote from the Ode to Man, which obviously needs a much more detailed philological explication than I can offer here. I will for the moment also leave the key concepts of deinon and deinotaton, defining what it means to be human or designating what it means to be human without a translation. There is much that is deinon, but nothing that surpasses man in deinotaton. He sets sail on the frothing waters, amid the south winds of winter, tacking through the mountains and furious chasms of the waves. Everywhere, journeying, inexperienced and without issue, he comes to nothingness. Clever indeed, mastering the ways or skills beyond all hope, he sometimes accomplishes evil, sometimes achieves brave deeds. This is really the most compressed you can get to. The attempt to formulate the syllogistic structure of the Ode to Man is much more complex. First, because it consists of three universal statements that in turn branch out into syllogisms about the mortality of humans that include particular statements as well as referring to particular human deeds and claims, primarily by Antigone and Creon, and secondly because of the use of the negative statements. I will try to clarify this gradually, but will begin by trying to form the three universal statements of the Ode to Man syllogism. This is just playing around, as I said before. Nothing surpasses humans in being Danon, or all humans are Danon. Since he sometimes accomplishes evil, sometimes achieve brave deeds, humans are defined by their inherent contradictory nature, or in other words, the law of the excluded middle does not apply to human nature or actions, which the example of Socrates before has already shown. Therefore, the attempt to apply the law of the excluded middle to humans will show that they are Danon. This is basically, although there are some fuzzy corners, the three universal statement syllogism. The crucial issue is how to interpret the word Danon, and what its hermeneutical horizons are. Readers, performers, spectators, as well as philosophers have struggled with and will no doubt continue to speculate about the contradictory perspectives presented by the play and to what extent they can be accommodated by this notion. According to the standard dictionaries, the term has a broad range of meanings referring to 1, fearful, terrible, dread, dire, in Sophocles also danger or suffering, awe, 2, a notion of force or power, mighty, powerful, wondrous, marvelous, strange, and 3, the sense of powerful, wondrous related to being able, clever, and skillful. The philosophical contextualizations of this concept developed by Heidegger and Butler, which I will only briefly refer to here, respond to this challenge, basing the readings of the dichotomy between the state and the family set up by Hegel's reading of Antigone. According to Samuel Weber, quote, to identify the Hegelian interpretation of Antigone with the position of Creon, for instance, privileging the authority of the state over the family, is to ignore the dialectical structure of the Hegelian text. Indeed, there is, Weber claims, a symmetrical negativity through which the relations between family and state become transformed into what he, Weber, describes as signifiers of something else, which has to do with the determination of identity in terms of individuality. In parentheses, what I'm talking about as the subjective syllogism position. Not individuality as such, but individuality mediated and reflective in its constitutive negativity, that is to say, individuality as spirit, end quote, Weber. Heidegger and Butler, however, trying each in their own way to rid themselves of Hegel's metaphysical ballast, formulates a Danon where a specific historical experience or an ideological question, rather than history or ethical issues, rather than history or spirit as such, creates a dynamic hierarchy where the discourse of the other is appropriated by one of the agonists, or in Butler's formulation, quote, becoming implicated in the idiom of the other, end quote. One of the many occasions when Heidegger formulated his position with regard to Danon was in a lecture in 1935 at the University of Freiburg, where he had been rector for a year just after Hitler came to power, which was first published, this lecture, in an introduction to metaphysics in 1953. In his reading, Heidegger emphasized, and now I quote, Danon means the powerful in the sense of one who uses power, who not only disposes of power, and the German word here is Gewalt, but is violent, Gewalttätig, insofar as the use of power is the basic trait not only of his action, but also being there, the Dasein. Here we use the word violence in an essential sense, extending beyond the common usage of the word, as mere arbitrary brutality. In this common usage, violence is seen from the standpoint of a realm which draws its standards from conventional compromise and mutual aid, and which accordingly disparages all violence as disturbances of the peace. And the quote goes on, but I'll spare you. And in a seminar on the Hölderlin hymn somewhat later, in Hölderlin's The Easter, which Heidegger taught during the summer of 1942 at the same University of Freiburg, he also included a detailed reading of the Ode to Man, valorizing state power. At this time, Heidegger more openly exposed his hermeneutic strategy by rejecting the rendering of Denon as ungeheuer, which Hölderlin had used in his 1804 translation of the play. Instead of ungeheuer, which can be rendered in English as frightening, monstrous, or extraordinary, Heidegger insisted on understanding Denon as unheimlich, uncanny, which had already been used by Freud, an author Heidegger probably never read, which in turn Heidegger phonologically, but without any etymological basis whatsoever, reads as unheimlich, that is unhomely, explaining that, and now comes the quote from Heidegger. Being unhomely is no mere deviance from the homely, but rather the converse, a seeking and searching out the homely, a seeking that at times does not know itself. This seeking shies at no danger and no risk. Everywhere it ventures and is underway in all directions. Heidegger's reading, appropriating or seeking for the homely, the Heimat if you want, regardless of the dangers, no doubt reflects the situation of Germany as Heidegger understood it during the summer of 1942, which we know now was a moment in history situated between Wannsee and Stalingrad. Butler's reading in Antigone's Claim, based on a series of lectures from 1998, 2 years before they were published, examines the dialectics between action and language and must be read in a completely different historical and ideological context, of course. Her point of departure is that, and I quote, although Hegel claims that her deed is opposed to Creon's, the two acts mirror rather than oppose one another, suggesting if the one represents kinship and the other the state, they can perform this representation only by each becoming implicated in the idiom, which I quoted before, of the other. In speaking to him, she becomes manly. In being spoken to, he is unmanned, and so neither maintains their position within gender, and the disturbance of kinship appears to destabilize gender throughout the play. End quote from Butler. According to Butler, Antigone can only claim her deed, that's her language, by embodying the norms of power she opposes in ways that are called manly, not only because she acts in defiance of the law, but also because she assumes the voice of the law in committing the act against the law. End Butler. Antigone's act against the law, assuming the voice of the law, is crucial for Butler's reading, drawing attention to the use of negation as a central rhetorical strategy in the play. In her answer to Creon, after she has been caught by the guard while burying her brother Polynicus, Antigone, in effect, refuses to deny that she can be associated with this act. In Butler's translation of the crucial sentence, I will not deny my deed, which Butler reads as a refusal to perform a denial, but is not precisely to claim the act. End quote from Butler. This generates the dialectics between action and language, of affirming the deed while at the same time denying that she has committed what she considers to be what Creon defines as a crime. Antigone's refusal to perform such a denial challenges the logical coherence of the law of the extended middle, which Butler, in a reading of the play, resolves by staging an exchange of gender positions between Antigone and Creon. Heidegger's position is exclusive, asserting that Danon at the same time both appropriates and disposes that which is not violent, while Butler's position is inclusive, arguing that Antigone and Creon become involved in an exchange of gender positions. For Butler, Sophocles' play performs an exchange of subject positions rather than, as Heidegger claims, Danon is a seeking and searching out the homely, a seeking that at times does not know itself, totally annihilating Antigone's position. According to Butler, on the other hand, the acts of Antigone and Creon mirror rather than oppose one another and point towards a mutual implication of discourses expressed through performative speech acts, affirmations as well as negations. Regardless of the radical difference between the positions of Heidegger and Butler, they are both expressions of a political activism based on certain ethical assumptions. And even if I have no doubt whatsoever which of the two positions I favor, it seems to me that Butler's formulation of a mutual interaction as two acts that mirror rather than oppose one another, that's her language, could be misleading, because a mirror only reflects the person who is on the same side of this mirror, looking at it from a particular subject position. And how can the mirror reflect something that is on the other side of the glass? Rather than employing the mirror metaphorically, dislocating its literal function as Butler does, or even psychoanalytically, which is Jacques Lacan's strategy, and which will not even begin to discuss here, I would rather opt for Foucault's direct phenomenological experience of the mirror as a possible point of departure for an ethical understanding of Danon. In his essay of Other Spaces, Heterotopias, Foucault depicts the fundamental complexities of the human condition, and thus also by implication of Danon, focusing on what we actually see in the mirror. Foucault: in the mirror I see myself where I am not, in an unreal virtual space that opens up behind the surface. I am over there where I am not, a sort of shadow that gives my own visibility to myself, that enables me to see myself where I am absent. Such is the utopia of the mirror, but it is also heterotopia, and I would read that as history, insofar as the mirror does exist in reality, where it exerts a sort of counteraction on the position that I occupy. From the standpoint of the mirror, I discover my absence from the place where I am, since I see myself over there. I will only here shortly reflect on this. On the basis of these reflections, meant literally because it focuses directly on the reflection of ourselves in the mirror, it is possible to argue that that to be human is to see and imagine ourselves where we are not, as an act or a deed that combines consciousness, compassion, and ethical responsibility. Without falling, I would put in parentheses, but this is a longer argument, into the traps of Levinas. Even if this takes away something of the political age from the more outspoken activism of Heidegger and Butler, taking the radical differences between them into account, I believe Foucault suggests a position we need to consider, a form of reflexive or reflective activism which has to be explored much more in depth than I will be able to do here. Oedipus Tyrannos. In Oedipus Tyrannos, the second play in the order of writing of the so-called Theban cycle, Sophocles adopted a completely different strategy. From the clarity of Antigone's vision of her own life, her past as well as her future, saying just after the Ode to Man that, "Die I must, I've known it all my life, how could I keep from knowing?" We move now instead to a drama of blindness, where the mirror reflecting a monstrous creature only reveals who he is when it is too late to take action or even make a claim. Oedipus, who has solved the riddle of the Sphinx about the universal identity of the humans, does not know what his own identity is. He will only find out when the riddle of the murder of Laius, the old king, is solved. the old king Isolde, when, as it turns out, Oedipus has performed the role of the detective, finding out that he himself is the murderer of his father, who after solving the riddle of the Sphinx has married his own mother. In Oedipus Tyrannos, Sophocles reversed his strategy from Antigone, where he had explored the consequences of the deeds, burying and lawmaking, in order to attain a more general understanding of what it means to be human. Oedipus, on the other hand, failed in fulfilling the command, know thyself, gnotes auton, inscribed over the gate of the temple at Delphi. He can only make the connection between himself and the deeds when nothing can be done. To clarify this situation, I will begin by looking more closely at the text of the riddle and Oedipus' answer, which are significantly not included in Sophocles' own text. The play itself only includes allusions to the fact that Oedipus has solved the riddle all by himself, without any help from the birds or the gods. This is obviously part of his hubris and the reason for his conflict with Tiresias. The riddle text, as well as Oedipus' answer, can however be found in several other ancient sources, and it must have been well known at the time. One source is the prefaces to Euripides' Phoenician Women, believed to have been written in 408 BC, 2 decades after Sophocles' own play was first performed, a few years before Sophocles' death. Euripides' formulations are quite poetic. There is on earth a creature with 2 legs, 4 legs, and 1 voice, 3 legs too. Alone it changes in form of creatures who exist on earth, in air, on sea. But when it goes resting on more feet, then the strength of its limbs is weaker. And here is the answer, which retrospectively reflects Oedipus' own life. Listen, like it or not, ill-winged songstress of death, to my voice, which will end your folly, you mean man, who crawling on the ground at first is 4-footed, a babe from the womb, then in old age leans on a stick as 3rd foot, with a burden on back bent double in old age. The universal statement, which can be derived from the riddle and the answer defining what a human is, can be summarized as all humans, as opposed to other creatures, have 1 voice and many legs, drawing attention to the human body as the defining characteristic of man. The voice, as Oedipus' answer emphasizes, his own voice, as opposed to the voice of the Sphinx, the ill-winged songstress of death, or even the oracle, while the legs have been inscribed in his name, Oedipus, clubfoot, also punning on Oedipus, knowing the legs, which he obviously did by solving the riddle. Going back for a moment to the Ode of Man in Antigone, we could perhaps also read it as a riddle, asking which creature on earth is Deinon by naming all the attributes appearing in the ode. The answers to these riddles can in effect be formulated as universal statements. In Oedipus Tyrannos, all humans have 1 voice and many legs, and in Antigone, as all humans are Deinon. But since the attributes assigned to humans in these 2 cases are imbued with a radical ambiguity or even with contradictions, they in some way, which I will develop in a moment, transgress the law of the excluded middle. They cannot, or only with severe restrictions, serve as the universal statements for a deductive syllogism. Since in particular in Oedipus Tyrannos they are derived from riddles, they follow a different logic from syllogisms. A syllogism, by adding a middle term to the initial universal statement, supposedly reaches an unambiguous conclusion. The answer to the riddle, on the other hand, in this case defining what it means to be human, is based on a process of interpretation of ambiguities, finally providing one of the many possible answers, supposedly the right one. But there is a wrong answer. A riddle is actually, by definition, a text which has several answers, some of which, according to certain implicit or contextual criteria, are incorrect, for which you get killed if you meet the Sphinx. Remember. Some of which, according to... There are also several implicit sets of rules to decide what the correct answer is, adding to the ambiguity of the hermeneutic process of solving riddles. We can even read the riddle of the Sphinx as a meta-riddle, defining this genre consisting of one text which has many answers, reflecting the definition of a human as a creature containing both one and many at the same time. Furthermore, Oedipus' ability to name the universal identity of humans does not entail the ability to know who he himself is. Does this mean that we have to formulate a more limiting statement, something like this? Some people who know the universal identity of humans do not know what they themselves are. Or should we accept Lévi-Strauss's analysis of the Gulbenkian family myth, ending with Antigone arguing that Oedipus on some level did not consider himself to be human, but rather as an autochthonous creature not born by woman. Oedipus' scar on the foot could be a sign that he had grown like a tree on the ground which had been cut down, Lévi-Strauss argues. It seems that regardless how we try to approach this issue, there will either be a middle term or a conclusion which, because of the riddle structure, contradicts a certain aspect of Sophocles' play or leads to an invalid syllogism. One way to tackle this issue is to examine the qualities or numbers referred to in the riddle itself more in depth. The one voice versus the many 2 or 3, 4 legs. They are abstract entities that are also echoed powerfully within the play itself. The question if Oedipus killed Laius depends on the exclusive opposition between one and many, because the herdsman who reported about the murder had until the very final scenes of the play always claimed that there were several murderers in order to protect Oedipus, while Oedipus himself knew that he had been alone when killing an old man where the 3 roads meet, and had therefore no reason to consider himself to be the murderer of the former king. From the point of view of the protagonist detective, the logic of the play is deductive, gradually gathering evidence in order to get a full picture from which it is possible to draw a conclusion who had murdered Laius. This distinction between one and many murders is obviously based on the law of the excluded middle. Before the arrival of the herdsman, still believing that there had been many murderers, Oedipus defends himself against accusations by a paradigmatic formulation of the law of the excluded middle, saying, and I quote, "The one and the many cannot be one and the same." Because of the new hitherto hidden evidence which will be brought forward by the herdsman, Oedipus will soon discover his own involvement in the crime and that he actually killed his father and married his mother, becoming the brother to his own children, upsetting the inner logic of kinship structure. However, from a strictly logical perspective, that the one and the many cannot be one and the same was contested by the riddle of the Sphinx, asking which creature simultaneously has one voice and many legs. So, and this will be my last sentence, there is obviously a huge tension between the logic of the narrative or the plot and the logic of what it means to be human. Thank you very much.
Freddie Rokem is a thespian, therefore he is also a philosopher. I think you've proven to us that you are the excluded middle. Freddie would be happy to take questions, answer riddles, deductions, comments. You're up.
Yes, thank you, Freddie, for a brilliant lecture. 2 remarks or questions. One, you talked about the 2 syllogisms. One, the one of Antigone and the one by Creon. Now, I want you, if you can say something about the hidden statements that you can find in both models. In Antigone, it's to say, you said to be human means to bury your relatives, and the hidden claim here is, or the hidden statement here is, I am most of all and before all, I am a human being. Antigone says on herself in a hidden way. And in Creon's syllogism, the hidden claim is that you're above all a civilian or a member of the community. Now, if you can say something about this hidden structure within the syllogism, because the basic conflict, I guess, stands on those hidden claims. What are you? Are you basically a member of the family or an individual, or on the other hand, are you most of all a member of the community? And if you explore those syllogisms, I guess you should take into consideration this hidden structure within the public structure. And this is my first question or remark. And the second,
can you maybe, I mean, we don't have that much time. Can we just first hear the answer to the first question?
I will be brief. As we all know, there are 3 plays, and there is the last one, which I didn't deal with at all. So there is a syllogistic structure between the 3 plays. Oedipus et Colonos gives the answer to that question of the polis and the family. And of course, there the whole logic of burying is completely thrown overboard because there is no grave. So I think to complete my but I didn't, it's where I put drew my line. There is a third part which reflects on the 2 previous ones, and then from a riddle we go to an enigma, which I think is what Oedipus et Colonos does by relating to the 2 previous. So this would create the syllogistic structure of the 3 plays. That's another hour and a few months of work, but I think that's where I will lead this argument about logic and tragedy.
Great. Yes. Yes, you please.
Okay. Just very briefly. First, out of curiosity, I've been reading in some biographies about Oedipus, that the answer to the riddle is himself, because actually a blind man also means a cane. Not only an old man. No, but that's just a curiosity. What is really for me important to understand from you, and I appreciate your lecture because I'm not from philosophy, I'm from literature, and it's I mean not hard, but I'm trying to having a thesis on Greek tragedy, the questions of syllogism and dialectics are all the more important. But anyway, is it not? Can I not say there is? However, in spite of all this similarity between drama and philosophy, there is of course an abyss between drama and philosophy, because on one side we have the truth or a true syllogism, and in drama you can have false syllogisms.
You can have false syllogism in philosophy too. There are lots of those. But the issue I think is the law of the excluded middle. That's where the real issue is lying. And tragedy asks what it means to be human, and will inevitably give something which is contradictory, because that's what tragedy is about. The contradictory nature of, or contradictory characteristics of human nature, because that's where the law of the excluded middle will break down. So there is a dynamics which has several aspects to it, and that's where they I don't think they implode. They're not the same. One philosophy and tragedy are not the same, but they are in such a strong clinch, like in a boxing match, that you cannot really separate them. I mean, with Laura's questions raised yesterday, there is sort of, what is the distance? Can we at any point divide between them? Yes, I think we do. When there is a knockout, you sort of, one is knocked down, then, but it's a very complicated dynamics, which needs another one. But That's if I understood the gist of your argument. Maybe you didn't ask a question yet. I'm sorry.
You quoted Aristotle, and then he further he emphasizes the difference. In that part in chapter 9, he brings them close, apparently, but then he states the undeniable difference between truth and between philosophy and tragedy, and he talks about the false syllogism as well. In poetry, men, if they believe this, then they will believe that that happened because of this, this being untrue, of course. So the ability of the poet to pursue a false, to rely on the syllogistic ability of the spectator. So that was just.
Is there another question, Kalina?
Yeah, I thought this was a fantastically illuminating reading and really incredibly rich. I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about how you see this reading in relationship to the Benjamin quote that you gave at the very start. There was something there that really struck me, and it stayed with me through your talk. And if I heard it correctly, he said, theory, parentheses, logic.
Just as philosophy makes use of symbolic concepts to draw ethics and language into the realm of theory, in the same way it is possible for theory, logic, to be incorporated into ethics and language in symbolic form. We then see the emergence of ethical and aesthetic critique.
Right. So
this was what I was trying to apply.
Yeah. Well, this is what I'm wondering is whether you see any implications in this sort of reading. So a reading that takes from deductive logic to what, in other words, whether there's a proposition here that you're making in relationship to how we understand theory. Does that make sense?
No. I mean, well, what we know about theory in this case is what some very small level of basic rules of Aristotelian logic. They will develop, and there are larger historical arguments about logic and Shakespearean tragedy, for instance. It's a huge topic, and I'm not even opening it at the moment. But there are different development. Here is just sort of the upper layer of Aristotelian logic, not more than.
I'm returning to your quotation from Benjamin. I believe that is a text which is a preparation for a later text on the Goethe's elective affinities. And in this elective affinities, he says that the works of art have some relatives. Their relatives are on the philosophical problems. But then he says that philosophy is unable to make a question about its own unity. And he calls this the ideal of the problem. The ideal of the problem is a non-question. It's a philosophy cannot put this question. But this non-existential question is buried in the works of art. And I think your lecture has to do with this, to relate philosophy and art, knowing that art does not make visible the ideal of problem, but the ideal of problem instead is buried in work of art. It's two different things. There's no equation between work of art and philosophical problem.
I don't think I can.
Yeah, and another thing is, at the end of your speech, you said that regarding Oedipus, that the riddle would transform it in enigma. For Greeks, the word is the same.
Yeah, I know.
You know better than me. It's not the problem. It's not the point. But you said also that the riddle has the possibility of having many answers. I think instead it is only possible one answer regarding the riddle, and if you don't give the right answer, you are in danger. But in the case in Oedipus, he was also in danger because he solved the riddle. The danger has 2 points, and also there I can stress the resistance to the law of the excluded middle. Excluded, yes. If you don't solve the riddle, you're dead. But if you solve the riddle, you are having trouble.
Yeah, that's what it is. I think with regard to Benjamin and his understanding of looking at art from the outside, I think we can approach it, as Martin mentioned, by talking about encounters, and especially his encounter with Brecht, which is what I wrote about in the book, and I've also developed in chess playing and other ways of communication. And the first summer they met, 1934, was crucial for the Passagenwerk, that summer. So it enabled him to get a kind of synoptic view, and he writes then to Adorno that this is what happened during the summer, and so on. So there, we kind of begin to approach it sort of more historically or biographically. To the second question about the riddle, there are 2 possibilities. All the people who came and Oedipus give the same answer. The Sphinx decides Hemon, who was killed, I mean the one in another mythical version, Hemon was killed. That's the son of Creon, because he gave the same answer, but he wasn't the right person. The right person, the right person is the one who will realize the other enigmatic text, which is the oracle. And that's one possibility. So Jocasta and the Sphinx decide, this is the guy we want to be in your bed. Go ahead. The other possibility is that there were other answers. I would opt for other answers by looking at texts like the Symposium and the myth of Aristophanes, which is a creature with 4 legs, which becomes 2-legged, a completely different mythological constellation than, or even go to Freud, which is sort of so crude that we don't even have to say what Freud says about the primal scene of 4-legged and 3-legged and 2-legged creatures, and of course one voice. That's the most important part. So I think there are openings in different directions. You don't have to exclude, you don't have to include. There are possibilities, and the stronger fate, one answer. The more playroom, many answers. So, but the riddle is defined. Könges Maranda, the logic of the riddle is defined by one text which has many answers. That's the definition. That's what you do when you play riddles. You have wrong answers.
If you collect the riddles that Greek invented, they have always one answer. The oracles is always against the principle of the excluded middle, absolutely, but not the common riddles.
No, the riddle is a different.
Riddles, yeah.
The riddle is a different hermeneutical strategy.
I'm getting worried about the extended coffee break, so I think we should give a round of applause to Freddie and to the question.